Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Before we go started with the event for today, which is jam-packed, we'll have some networking also slotted in with Q&A. But before we go through that, I just wanted to share with you a few housekeeping rules. Please do stay muted and off camera. You will have a chance during the Q&A. We'll also have 50 minutes at the end of today's event to do some networking. And that will be a time for you to get off camera and to unmute yourself and ask any questions you need. Feel free to ask questions and chat with other attendees during the chat feature. Highly recommend that you exchange LinkedIn, any other forms of contact information so that you can stay in contact with each other, but also notify support. We have Mike, who is here to help us with tech support. So feel free to ask him for any types of questions or issues that you have with currently for the event. Now, before we go ahead and get started, just know that we have live transcripts in place. So you can read about closed captioning as well. It should be on your top left. Otherwise, it might be in your bar in Zoom. Just make sure you tap on those and you'll see it. It was provided by Otter AI. Now for our agenda today, it's only roughly 30 minutes. We're going to do rapid speed. I want to walk you through a ton of stuff in mixed method research for an introduction, including a framework that will help you in tactical examples in product, but also in service design. So we'll tackle both. And then we have 15 minutes near the end for Q&A for any questions you have. A lot of you have already emailed me for questions that were pretty interesting in terms of how do you get started in MMR. And then at the end, it's completely optional. No worries if you can't make it. I wanted to give you time to do some networking. And so we'll be in cool specific groups, roughly around maybe 2 to 3 people per group, and it will not be recorded whatsoever. And for you to get to know, we have some prompts also available, so to make it less awkward. And so onto that, to the agenda, I'll actually turn off my my video just so that you can focus on the presentation at hand, and then I'll get back onto camera during the Q&A. So I'll stop video and then we can go ahead with our discussion. So before we do that, if you don't know about me, I'm Ilham Ali. My pronouns are she, hers, or Aya. I'm a senior user researcher and experience designer with over 9 years of experience in user research, but also UX design, as well as project management in public health and digital health. So I worked with government agencies, enterprises, and even high growth startups in obesity, diabetes, substance use disorders. So I currently work with a wonderful nonprofit organization with local and state governments in COVID-19 crisis response. But before that, I actually worked with a ton of clients like Tyson, Nestle, Stockpile, New York State Department of Health, and a lot more. So a lot of what influences my research process is through health equity and trauma-informed care and just a sense of social justice. So if you're ever interested in those fields, just let me know and I'll be happy to talk to you about. And one fun fact, I used to be a classical violinist for like 12 to 13 years. And I used to perform in a mariachi band in Los Angeles. It was a ton of fun and I really enjoyed it. Now, let's get into just a couple of disclaimers. One is that all opinions in this event is reflective of mine. They don't reflect my clients or the organization I work with. And number 2 is that do keep in mind mixed method research for this event is introductory. We're not going to talk about advanced methods like different methods we would do with social justice or intervention. We won't talk about specific survey design if you're interested in the quant part or the qual part. But if you are interested in advanced topics like that, there will be an option in the survey after this event where you can just let me know if there are any topics you want us to talk about. We'd be happy to do that. I'll also be using acronyms just for efficiency. So I'll say MMR a lot. That's mixed method research. Qual for qualitative, quant for quantitative. But also just remember, for those of you who come from academia, please don't bash me. I come from an academic background. And so academic research is not the same thing as industry research. In fact, industry research is very different in the sense that it's much more agile, it's lean, it's faster. It can be a mix of high and low risk, but we tend to have a different trade-off and balance between rigor and validity, which academic research really highly values. And so those are things I want you to continuously to think about and to understand what types of biases and assumptions that come in during the research process. And then the last thing that I wanted to focus on is that this is of really importance between understanding a framework for you to make decisions. And we won't be focusing a lot on toolings like, oh, what tool should I be using for a survey for this type of design and research design? Those are different discussions. And here I wanted to give you a framework for you to make decisions on. I promise, one last thing, actually I lied. Keep your questions general, because every person's situation is really unique. And I want to make sure that everybody benefits from this discussion by making sure everybody's questions are generalized for everybody to know. Okay, let's get into the discussion. Cool. So when you think about MMR, I'm going to make certain hypotheses about what you might be thinking, and this is how I felt when I started with MMR. A lot of times you think about from the perspective that, oh, it's super cool, but I'm not really sure the first step that I want to take. Some of you might even think that you're in the middle of your research projects and you don't know how to validate the data. And then some of you might just feel really stuck because you're probably in a research team of one or one person wolf pack and have limited resources. So trust me, I've been there and I know it. It's really overwhelming when you have so much information on the internet and you just need someone or something to guide you. And the opposite is actually quite true. So you're not in this alone. So your stakeholder might be thinking a bunch of other things as well. And by stakeholder, I mean anybody that you work with who has power, authority, or decision-making influence into a project that you're at. So think like your client, your manager, your team members, engineering teams, product, design, research, etc. And that's also anybody from C-suite management as well. And they're probably thinking, well, we already have in Hum all this qualitative data. Why do we even need to invest in quant data selection? It doesn't make sense. And the opposite is true. Your company might be very quant data driven and they don't really see much value in collecting customer stories and qual data. And other people just don't have the expertise, the resources, and they don't maybe have resources like mixed method researchers at hand. So they're scared and they're nervous and they're very skeptical about making a change. And with that in mind, for what is a mixed method research, it's essentially thinking of it as yourself as a circle. Okay, you come in with your own influence, biases, as well as incentives. And your goal is to avoid data discrepancies, and you even want to fuel product decisions. That's your goal. And then here's another circle that your stakeholder is coming at, and their goal is to improve the bottom line of the business, and they want to use data to make decisions. They care more so about outcomes and less so about research insights. And that's very important because you as a researcher, you're being paid for outcomes, not insights. And the question is, how might we work together in order to inform data that drives the business and drives customer happiness? And this is what we call triangulation. And this is the purpose of mixed method research. Triangulation means that you obtain different multiple perspectives because one data source is inefficient. So you combine methods knowing that limitations of each methods are offset by strengths of the other. So let me give you tactical examples from industry. And by industry, I always mean private sector, so just keep that in mind. So one example is that you are a researcher that are currently developing a new mental health app that's about to launch the market. So one thing that you're kind of wondering about is, how do I study depression status and how do I determine that? So just one simplified version of mixed method research is that on the quantitative scale for mental health app, you would collect, for example, physician rating, patient rating, and different types of scales in depression. And on the qualitative scale, you'll do semi-structured interviews. And what mixed method research does super well, it helps you understand experimental results. So think process and outcome. And we can talk a little bit more about how this really fits into your customer journey map if you're doing custom for mixed method research. And you will need mixed method research if you need to explore versus explain. And I'll show you what that means specifically when it comes to your one of your studies in different sequences. The other attributes I want you to think about is that we collect this data because we want rigor. Your role as a mixed method researcher, specifically in any scenario that you're coming into a project, if it makes sense to have MMR, is that you want to bolster the collectiveness of your evidence. You need to come in and show that you have rigor so that you can boost a specific business case that you're advocating for. And you also want to prioritize maybe one form of data, and you want to frame process and a procedure that makes sense theoretically, but also in reality. So one thing that MMR is not, I want you to be very clear about that, is that it's not just using about the name, not the methods. Just because it's not because it's just cool. It's something that it's super helpful to understand why the use case of. And I don't want you to use MMR just because you have quant and qual data. There are cases in industry that it does not make sense for you to use MMR, and that you should probably use them in different cases and even separately. But also, you don't have the right tools and techniques to collect qual and quant data. So that's a few other things where MMR is not. Now let's move on to basics of qual and quant research. You might know this, but I just want to make sure that we all start at the same foundation level. There are different approaches for you to generate knowledge. So on the first hand, you have quant data. So quant research tends to be a deductive approach, and it's broad, it's generalizable, and it focuses a lot on how much and when. And it tends to take specific pros, and it has some of its cons too. But before that, you can see here on my screen, there is a specific scale where you start off with a theory and quant data. Then you form your hypothesis and observation until you can validate or invalidate those observations. And the main pros about using quant is that you study a lot of variables and you have a large number of people or a sample size, and it helps you reduce your information to numbers, which is very helpful if any of you is working in GovTech or any policy decision making. It's super helpful and allows you to see comparison of trends over time, which qual data doesn't. The thing about quant, by itself, is that it gives you little understanding of individual experiences. So it's not very useful in explaining the attitudes, the behaviors, or even health indicators. And you probably see me here say health a lot because I come from a digital health and public health background. So it might be a little bit more tailored, this event, to health outcomes. On the other hand, you have qual. Qual research tend to focus on an inductive approach. So it's in nature, in-depth contextual picture. So think about the how, the why, the what. And what's really nice about qual, it provides you unanticipated areas of interest, something that we call unknowns. Those are unknowns risks. So example, you are part of a research project and you have zero idea about how, for example, African Americans approach diabetes education. You have no idea about that. You don't have any historical context whatsoever. So this is a very good use case to use qual. And the other part about it is built from the views of participants, not researchers. The only off thing about this, the cons, they're on qual. One, it's so small samples, which is probably the bane of every researcher's. I see some of you maybe nodding your heads like, yeah, I've gotten that question like, oh, it's a small sample size. How is this true? How is this statistically significant? Which is not even the point in qual research. And then you also have others who will challenge you, and they'll tell you that it's not rigorous as quant. And they might challenge you as well that it's labor and time intensive. So it takes a lot of budget from maybe your supervisor. But the approach of qual is it's the inverse of quant. So we observe human behavior. We make patterns based on how we code, how we collect them into categories and themes until we form a tentative hypothesis that leads to a theory, a working theory. Now let's review just a few really quick examples of qual and quant, and I'll share why these have to work together in the next few slides. There's a ton, and I'll read them out. On quant, we have surveys, A/B multivariate testing, usability testing, especially unmoderated usability testing, so you can assess scores like SUS scores. You have imaging, sorting. You also have a ton of technology-based tracking like heat map tracking, and a ton more, eye tracking. On qual, you have a bunch of observation. Focus groups is very much oriented in marketing. It's probably the best thing for market research. I don't use it much for qual research anymore. You also have interviews, diary studies, concept testing, ethnographic studies. So there's a ton. But what I want you to get out of this is that some questions cannot be answered by one method alone. And you as a researcher, you are free to use all possible methods, combining both inductive and deductive thinking. And I'll show you how to do it in a framework with specific sequence. Now, onto a framework that we can both balance qual and quant. What helps is for you to think about it in the terms of attitudes versus behavior. What you're going to see here on my screen is part of a three-dimensional framework that's adapted from Christian Rohr. And attitudes is about what people say versus behavior is what people do. This helps us contrast a few things, and it's very much needed also in marketing. So for example, usability testing informs us about an example on behavior. And we've already talked a lot about this, but one thing I want you to focus on is also the work that you have to make a decisions on whether to use qual and quant. And one thing to note about this is that qual is behaviors and attitudes directly applied in real life, while quantitative research is behaviors and attitudes indirectly applied, especially when you're doing different forms like surveys. The last context is for this framework, this dimension is called context and use. And it really depends on what you're using this product, the service, if it's scripted, if it's part of a study, if it's long-term, what's the lifespan of it. And so I know that these three frameworks is pretty arbitrary, so I want to put it in practice so that you can see it with some color. And this is just another example from the Nielsen-Norman Group article by Christian Rohr. It's called the What-Why framework, and it highlights some of the methodologies in each quadrant. Now, this is the context and use, and this is what I'll focus on for the rest of the event. When you're thinking about your mixed method research, you always want to first, step one, identify the research problem that you want to study or investigate. It's a very intricate process, and then we can dedicate a whole event for. And it essentially covers the 5 W's: the who, where, what, when, why. And the who and the where is your unit of analysis, and your what is your point of focus. And you want to make sure that your point of focus has a really important reference point, because it really sets the bar of what type of bias and assumption you can come in as a researcher. And that eventually impacts how you plan out your study, who you recruit as participants, how you conduct your interview guides if you're doing qual research. And we'll show also a little bit more example. The second step as part of designing a mixed method research is that define or determine whether a mixed method research study is even possible. So one decision making that you could do in project management, we have something called the triple threat. The triple threat is like a pyramid. It has 3 steps. You think about your scope, your budget, and your schedule. If one of them decreases, the other two increases. An inverse relationship. So if you need to cut back on scope, it means that you have more time and more money to dedicate for other things. And so that's a conversation that you have to do with your team. If you're a team of one researcher, that's a conversation you have to think about with yourself, but also if with your client or whoever you're providing a service to. Number 3 is develop a clear rationale before you even define the method of why you're doing MMR. Is it really necessary? And there are different sequences to doing MMR. Step 4 is to identify the appropriate mixed method design for you to guide your data collection. And this is the step that says choose method, qual or quant. And we'll show you 3 sequences where you can make that decision. Number 5 is for you to develop your research question. You need to, if you're going to do both as part of your mixed method approach, you have to write a research question for your quant method and then research question for your qual method. So that's different from your research problem that you started with. Your research problem is broader, generalizable, and you really want to focus on just the main outcomes and impacts that you want to focus on. And then step 6, just read a little bit more about what's happening in the literature so you can have a written point of view and a review. And then step 7, you have already identified your respondents, which is also your participants. You developed a plan to recruit them and you figure out a study. And then you collect that data, you analyze that. And then step 9, that's when you develop recommendations and conclusions and you prepare your final report in however way that you've done it. So if you use SPSS, SAS, this is very academic driven. So we already have a ton. In Qual, for example, of using, for example, we have Dovetail, we have a ton of other resources, Atlas TI, and Quant, we have a lot more. We have Google Analytics. You can even use Python R. You can even use Excel. We can talk a little bit more about that later too. So that's just the general 10 to 11 step overview that you would want to think about. Now, when we talk about your research problem, I'm going to challenge you to start thinking about it from the perspective of outcomes and impact. This is a special note on outcomes. So a good model, like the theory of change or a logic model that you can see here on my screen, it has 5 steps. And it starts out with inputs, activity, outputs, outcomes, and impact. This is really helpful as a good measurement in product and service design, because it helps give you a framework about how do you manage your research problem and even define your research question. And that is, what are the types of resources for you to implement your product and your service? And this is very good for you to figure out in your customer journey map. And what are the types of activities that your user need to do as part of the product of their service? And how do you track what was done? So this could be, for example, number of signups as part of onboarding process in a mobile app, as an example, number of users who've unsubscribed from a newsletter. You can also convert that into outcomes. So what is the difference between outcomes and impact? Anyone can tell me in the chat? Anyone? Any guess? Okay, I can tell you. So outcomes is about different attitudes as well as knowledge acquiring. It could be, that's a good guess, Morgan, long-term, short-term. Technically, if you dive deeper into outcomes, you can have short, medium, and long-term outcomes. They differ. The main difference is that with outcomes is more so on the types of attitudes and knowledge that you obtain. So for example, from this mobile app, that's diabetes education, you've increased your knowledge and you can measure that. You've increased your satisfaction. You improved your confidence in terms of understanding the types of behaviors you need to take for healthy action for diabetes management. Impact, on the other hand, is behaviors that are evident in your in the way that you demonstrate your actions. So, for example, within COVID-19 crisis response, increased vaccination rates, increased in specific acquiring of services that's related to COVID-19 testing within testing sites for low vaccinated geographies. Those are just a few examples that will influence your, not only the product decisions, but also the business decisions that will help give a place for alignment. Now, with that in mind, I want to go and move forward to different sequences. There are actually a lot more sequences. There are technically 6 sequences for how you organize a mixed method research project. I'm only showing you the top 3, which is the most common that you will face in industry and the most popular as well. And your research approach should focus first on your research questions and problems, like I mentioned, and they have to have some form of rigor. And so the first one, let's start with convergent. So convergent parallel, this is where you do both quant and qual data collection so that you can compare data insights, and then you come to a form of interpretation. This is probably the most popular for somebody who's new to mixed method research. The second one is called explanatory, because you start off with quant and then you end off with qual. And it helps make your quant results more understandable. So for example, you would do concept testing so that you can understand potential customer segments that are maybe using a new meditation app. The third and last one is exploratory sequence. That's when you start off with qual and then you end with quant. You want to understand, for example, broader applicability of small sample qual finding. So one example would be product market fit using a survey so that you can understand purchasing behavior. And then you would follow that up. You would start it off with qual, with understanding of themes in your interviews, and then you would hone down a little bit more in your survey as an example. So starting off with convergent. Convergent design is about collecting and comparing qual and quant data simultaneously. This is a really, really good way for you to reduce participation fatigue. There's actually a pretty good article that's now turned into a guide. It's called "Why Am I Always Being Researched?" which is now a guidebook for community organizers and researchers to help us get from inefficient understanding to more authentic truth through equity. And the second part about why conversion design is pretty good is that it helps you get a complete understanding from 2 databases and allows you to corroborate from different methods. And the goal here is always going to be triangulation no matter what, because you're going to obtain different but complementary data from the same topic. So the pros about this, just in general, is that it's intuitive, it makes sense, and it's used by a lot of researchers new to MMR. It's efficient, and it also lends itself to teams. And typically researchers who are experts like in different teams, this is a really good use case. So I want you to use this design if you need to collect both type of data in one visit to the field. And by one visit to the fields, I mean either physically or literally digitally. And the second part is both types of data have equal value for you to understand the research problem. And if you are doing this, typically it's good to have quant and qual research data at the same time. It will help you manage extensive data collection. There are a lot of challenges for this, and I'm going to just be upfront about it in case you're interested. Like if you're going to talk to your team about this, it's a lot of work. It really is. And I know how it could be fatigued by it as a researcher. And you will get some issues with samples and sample size. So how do you select, for example, the sample so that the data makes sense? And sometimes it's difficult to merge 2 sets of different data. And so I want to, before I go in through how do we collect and compare data here tactically, I want to share an actual scenario so that it gives you a little bit more color. So let's say this is a real life situation, by the way. Let's say you are a researcher and your task to research food safety knowledge, practice beliefs in Hispanic families who have young children in the United States. And you are good to go, allowed to do convergent design. What would be your qualitative research question? If you have a guess, just think about it for a little second. And it could be anything. So think about what we thought about in terms of your research problem, the 5 W's. What's your point of reference? So one question for research question for qual is, what are the types of beliefs towards food safety education among this population. And you can even put a time period in it if it helps part of your research study. And one example would be for you to start, here it says focus groups, and this is part of a research project. I'll probably remove research groups because of bias, put here interviews instead. But you'll follow up with a quant survey. So the way that you see this specific data collection is that there are 3 different types of variants where you collect data. So one of them is called parallel databases. So this is where you take, these are called strands. You collect them independently, and then you bring them together during interpretation. You collect different databases. The second is called data transformation. So that's where you as a researcher, you have to quantify your qualitative findings so that the qualitative data can be combined with quantitative data. And there are multiple forms of doing that. The third one is data validation. This is probably very popular. This is where you have results from your open-ended questions that you use to confirm or validate the results from your closed-ended questions. This is super common. If you want to do it the reverse way, you use quant to validate qual. And this scenario that I gave you is super real. And it actually comes from a specific case study that happened where they did actually focus groups for the study. And they found out that there are a few themes that emerged from their focus groups, which is ethnic dishes, related to food illnesses, fresh food in the home country, even food practices, and face-to-face learning. Guess what they found in this mixed method research? They found that high self-confidence in preparing food safety is associated with low safe food handling knowledge and the presence of some cultural beliefs. Now, I don't know if this has reverse causality, but I know that there's some association based on the study there, and I'll be linking it in the resources section of this presentation so that you can read a little bit more about what happened. Now let's go on to the second type of sequence, which is explanatory. This is where you are interested in using quantitative results to explain or eventually give more color through qualitative results. And you start off first with analyzing quant data, and this can be in data sets. And by the way, if none of you here are quant researchers, don't worry at all, because we can talk a little bit more about what are the types of minimal viable tools that you need to understand of statistics, like in the Q&A if you're interested. And so this steps, like I mentioned, starts out looking at data sets, user product behavior at scale. So you can use big data tools like Google Analytics, Segment, Mixpanel. By the way, these have a lot of, like for example, Google Analytics has an academy for it. Mixpanel has a free course on it. So you can Google that and you can access it. You can also bring your insights in a qualitative deep dive so that you can learn more about the context of numbers through like interviews. I've even seen researchers do research through online community discussions through Reddit. It's pretty awesome. So you would want to choose this type of design if you know that you need to explain and interpret the quantitative findings. So here's an example. And this is my real life example that I've done for a client last year. I was actually tasked to understand purchasing behaviors, also to understand different user segments for a talent sourcing solution. And our user segment was very focused on specific targets. So my qualitative research question that I came in when I first started is that I really wanted to understand what are the barriers and facilitators, what are the types of variables that is needed from a talent sourcer to make a decision if they wanted to buy a solution that we were offering in the United States. So the way I did this was I started off, because I already had a ton of thematic analysis research that's already been done historically. I had an archive with that. And I started off with a few variables that would make those types of decisions because there's a plethora of solutions like this in the market. And my quant survey was focused on those decisions. I've used conjoint analysis. I also used MaxDiff and TURF in order, and those are statistical methods in order to understand how would somebody value specific feature over others, and what would be the sequence of those values. And then I ended up with validating those variables that I had in qualitative observations and interviews at the end. So that's just another example. The last example I want to talk to you about is exploratory sequential design. This is where the opposite is true from the other one, and it puts qual first. And it usually typically involves a user interview sprint, but it can take a form even of an online survey with open-ended questions. And it helps you, the findings of the step typically informs quant research that happens afterwards. So this is usually means like the insights you take from qual, use them to inform from a quant project like a quant survey, or even unmoderated usability testing. And it helps you in your quant step to quantify the significance of your qualitative insights. So this is where all the hot stuff about significance really comes into play with confidence levels. So you'd want to choose this design if you want to explore a phenomenon, identify themes. This is probably the most common that I've seen in projects that I've worked on, and helps you, the intent is for you to use qual data, typically in small groups, so that you can determine the variables and questions that you want to inform your quant data collection. But it's very time consuming. Many of you might know this already. And this approach is really good if you're working in a research problem with a lot of unknowns, like I told you, the unknowns. And it will help you form a hypothesis that you can validate or invalidate later. And one example here, well, let's take this. You're a researcher in a community health center, and you are researching patient preferences for text messaging from providers about smoking cessations. And so your quant research here is to figure out a specific relationships. What's the effect of text messaging interventions with smoking cessations and different other therapies that are with it? So that's just an example of how you would frame on a simplistic term, like a research question. I'm pretty sure there's like a lot more than what I'm showing here. But a design example would be you start off with qual of interviews. You can end with quant based on your themes and your hypothesis of what types of messages would resonate the most in the A/B tests and validate in a larger sample size in a survey. I'm going to pause here and end with challenges that you will probably see in the field, which is ones that I've also faced in my own career. The first one is stakeholder buy-in. Is probably the hardest because I get this question a lot. My company leans into qual, or my company leans into quant. What should I do? I'm really scared. I'm frustrated. They don't see my point. So uncertainty can make anybody's approval difficult. It's probably part of human nature. So one way for you to navigate this is a concept called mirroring. And that's when you use language that your stakeholder knows best. That we use this also in patient education to reinforce learning about chronic diseases. And you want to use those terms that make sense to your stakeholder. If they're C-suite, they care potentially about business metrics, operationals, performance operations, efficiencies, the bottom line, and you want to tailor your business case for that. The second thing I hear about is budget. We don't have the budget. It's a really tough one. You probably want to think about funding sources if you can pull budgets from other sources or departments while keeping their incentives in mind. And you want to align your incentive. If you're taking budgets from marketing, you want to show how this supports marketing. The other part is human resources. You probably are like maybe a one-person wolf pack, a UX team of one. So you want to learn and empower not just yourself, but also your team to think in an MMR paradigm. So this can be in a form of a toolkit, a guidebook for future teams to pick up. It helps show that you're the catalyst for this change of thinking. And it's a very popular method of MMR. This is not new. This has been going ages in academia that industry has definitely caught on and thought about product growth, especially in marketing. The other part is bias. We as researchers and designers, we all have our point of references, from internet access to language to culture, and that inherently frames our design decision making. And that in itself, there are certain power dynamics you think about. So one of the important things when you're thinking about a culture that really leans heavily to one or the other, which should not be anymore, is that to do some bias training. And you yourself are your own leader. You want to understand, for example, the technical and team debts within your company, within your maybe your freelance business, if you have one, as an exercise of design thinking workshop. So you want to ask, for example, in an anonymous survey, people's research superpowers. What do they know? What do they don't know? How can you complement each other? How can you train each other? Understand what those points of biases and assumptions are. The last part is data deficiency. I was actually asked a really good question from somebody who's attending today's event. They asked me, how do you take decisions when there's not enough research data? So despite all of the data that's available to mankind, people often struggle to convert it into effective solutions to problems. Instead, everybody falls prey. Has anybody heard the garbage can decision making by any chance? Anyone? The garbage can decision making is actually a theory that Jim March and his co-authors wrote in a paper, and it's about where a progress where actors, problems, and possible solutions, they just swirl in this metaphorical garbage can, and people end up agreeing whatever solution rises to the top. The problem isn't lack of data inside the garbage can. The vast amount of data means managers struggle or researchers struggle to prioritize what's important. In the end, they apply arbitrary data towards new problems and reaching subpar solution. So for you as a researcher to curb this garbage can decision making, you should think about carefully about the information you need to solve a problem, and think more strategically about how do you apply it to your decisions and decision making and action. So there's a framework called DIET. It's DIET. It's a 4-step process to convert data, minimal viable data, into actions and knowledge. It's so DIET stands for define the problem, integrate multiple viewpoints, explore solutions, and then test it out. And a lot of this you would need to go back into different assumptions that you can validate through rigorous iterations. And there are a bunch of resources. By the way, this is not exhaustive. There's a ton more, but I want to leave it to the Q&A for you to ask questions. I know we have roughly 8 minutes, so I'm going to go back on camera so that I could answer any questions you have. I do have the first top 3 listed out here because this was probably the most common that I've gotten so far. Thank you for everybody who submitted it. But I was curious, would you like me to answer these questions, or do you want me to answer questions listed in the chat? Let me know. By the way, I'm super good with awkward silences. And so great. We have 1 person. That's all the sample size I need. Awesome. And so the first question I get, how do I get started in mixed method research? So think with the end in mind. Think with a problem that you need to start solving, like a project. Why? Because it helps you frame what's the 80-20. What's the 20% of knowledge and skill sets that I need in order to impact 80% of my results. It helps also frame and restrict the scope of work that you need to get done, so that you need to understand what are the methods in qual and quant that I need to understand and become really good at and an expert in, so that I can solve this problem. So that's number 1. Number 2 is do a skills audit. Figure out what's missing, because a part of that project? And what are the available open source tools that you can have in order for you to solve this problem? Number three, find a community. There's like a ton of communities online right now in Slack groups. There's one that's in the chat right now. This is called the Mixed Methods Research Group. It's in Slack. It should be in the chat where you can add yourself and invite. There's a ton of good literature, really good people who have discussed this topic at length and be able to help you. Lastly, you can find mentors. There are free mentors who are amazing user researchers on ADP list. I'm a mentor. I offer free mentorships. I have no agenda whatsoever, so feel free to connect with me. I'll be happy to talk about this. So those are ways for you to feel empowered and to feel that you have a community that's behind you. I see another question. Do you do both parts, quant and qual, or different people responsible for different parts? It's a really good question. It really depends. So I've been in teams where I focused more on quant, and then I have another team member who does qual. So we mix it up, mainly because we bring both expertise. Other times I've been actually in projects where I was the only researcher assigned. So by scope and by also resources, I was kind of forced to do it both wise. So it really just depends on the triple threat that I mentioned: scope, schedule, and as well as budget, but most likely resources, which is the budget that defines. It's really nice to bring in another researcher on board, mainly because two minds is better than just one person solo. Cool. The other question is references or places to find mixed method playbook. So in this, there should be also in the chat, I love two books that I've read over in grad school, but even till this day. The first one is Designing and Conducting Mixed Method Research. Is by John Creswell. He also wrote a second book, which I highly recommend. It's called Research Design: Qualitative, Quantitative, and Mixed Method Approaches. I highly recommend that you take a look into them. There's another question from Jen. From your knowledge, are there some corporations or industries that support MMR more than others? It seems MMR is being asked for more often. Yes. So FANG companies, so Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft are employing a ton of mixed method researchers. They also are ones that are really the pioneer of not just being onboarding qualitative researchers, but also quant researchers. Quant researchers in those realms tends to be PhDs from academic background, but they highly apply for mixed method researchers. I've seen also like-minded agencies that are applying for mixed method researchers. It's good for their budgets, 2 in 1. But also mixed method researchers are able to think holistically about different data-driven decisions, but also really understand the human conditions. So they are out there, but those 3 companies that I mentioned are definitely employing. Awesome. So the third question is best tools to conduct MMR. And I'm going to try to be super tool agnostic, but soon there is in the chat something called the UX Research 2021 Tools Map. I didn't create this. It was actually created by somebody else, but I thought it was pretty brilliant in the terms of like the different tools available in user research. But here are ones that I love and have used over time. So in vivo, I don't think it's free. I think you would need to get a subscription for it. Let me think on that. So NVivo is definitely a good one. Number 2 is Max QDA. Both does qual and quant. You can try it out for free, so you can get a feel. Deduce is another. There's good old-fashioned R and Python, and also Excel. The reason I put my hands up is because it's really good if you know how to use macros, VBAs, and different equations as well. And there should be a tool there for data analysis, last time I've heard. So a lot of these tools are employed in academia. There's also ones in industry, but to be honest, I haven't seen a really robust one that does qual and qual. But on the qual side, definitely Aurelius, Dovetail, Reduct, and Sure, I won't add them to the chat right now, but I'll add them into the names of these tools, definitely in an email after this event. So those are the top 3 questions. Oh, I see more questions. How do you determine quant sample size versus qual sample size in an MMR study? It's a really good question. I'm going to answer both like separately and see how they converge together. So a quant sample size is determined by at least 3 factors. One is your population size. So the overall population of the study that you're trying to look at for your audience. The second is your margin of error. So the larger your margin of error is, the larger that you'll have a lot of inaccuracy as part of it. And then the last part is your significance level or your confidence level. And that's where you want to figure out if you want to be confident about the level of errors that are happening is within 95%, 99%, etc. On the qual side, it's essentially we're trying to figure out how do we reach a level of saturation in our themes. And so that means some people have sworn by with NN group, what they've mentioned is 3 to 5, at least the golden rule, because you'll get saturated by themes, and you can think about it, that's per user segment. Otherwise, I've seen up to like 30 until you get saturated in thematic analysis, and that's when you've seen the redundancy, and you want to get to that point. So it's pretty variable. So I can't really answer that question because it really depends on the study organization. I see right now it's 550. Oh yeah, Anastasia, love that point. 5 to 8 is optimal for qual. And then 20 respondents is enough. Cool. By the way, I think Sierra was just talking to me, so you might have heard that. Okay, we have passed the point where we need to do some networking. So if you have any other questions, definitely feel free to add that into the survey or to the post-event email. I'm going to go to networking right now. We only have 10 minutes, but if you're interested, we can stay a little bit longer for that. I'll put everybody in, I'll pause recording right now, and then we will stop recording.